Good morning and welcome. Thank you for being with us today. The Remembrance Day was established by a resolution, the number 60, of the General Assembly of the United Nations in 2005. It mandates that every country has the duty to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. Italy had already approved a law in the year 2000, which instituted the Giorno della memoria, in remembrance of the extermination and persecution of the Jewish people and the Italian military and political deportees to the Nazi camps. The Italian law also provides for the organization of commemorative educational events every year, with the aim of dialogue, reflection, and study on the values of solidarity and tolerance. Moreover, January 27 has a very strong symbolic meaning. At the end of the Second World War, on that day, the Soviet army opened up Auschwitz gates and put an end to the persecution of the Jewish people, but not just the Jewish people. Ethnic minorities, homosexuals, prisoners of war, political opponents, and people with handicaps were also deported and to Auschwitz. The Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, through its diplomatic networks and the Italian Cultural Institute worldwide, is committed to promoting and organizing these commemorative events every January 27. It is therefore our duty and our right to speak about the Holocaust today, to remember so as not to forget. I would like to thank the Dante Alighieri Society of British Columbia and the Club Giuliano Dalmata in Toronto for partnering with us to co-presenting this event. A warm welcome to writer Rosanna Turcinovich Giuricin, who will present her magnificent book, In the Maelstrom of History, A Conversation with Miriam. I would like to thank also the Miles Nadal Jewish Community Center in Toronto for their promotional support of today's event. And without further ado, I'm passing my microphone, my virtual microphone, to Dr. Arianna Dagnino from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, who will also be our moderator today. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica, and welcome on behalf of the Dante Alighieri Society of BC in Vancouver. Welcome to all of you to our roundtable. Let me briefly introduce today's panelists, starting from the author of the book that we shall be discussing to commemorate the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, Rosanna Turcinovich. Rosanna is an international journalist and writer based in Trieste, Italy, and the winner of the 2021 Fulvio Tomizza Award. She's the author of many books dealing with historical dramatic facts happened during World War II, including the one that we will be discussing today, written in Italian first and published with the title Miriam agli occhi viola, and then translated in English by Professor Konrad Eisenbichler with the title In the Maelstrom of History, A Conversation with Miriam, and published by the Club Giuliano Dalmato in Toronto in the series Arpa d'Or. So welcome, Rosanna. Konrad Eisenbichler is Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto. He has published important works on the immigration to Canada of Italians from Venezia Giulia, Istria, Fiume, and Dalmatia. He is the editor of El Boletín, the quarterly newsletter of the Club Giuliano Dalmato di Toronto, and the founding editor of the book series Arpa d'Or. A prize-winning author and translator, he is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a commendatore in the Order of Merit of the Republic of Italy, and a winner of the Ennio Flaiano Prize. So welcome, Konrad. Diego Bastianutti was born in Fiume Italy in 1939 and is a member of the Giuliano Dalmato diaspora in North America. A now retired university lecturer in Italian and Spanish literature at Queen's University, he has also been an international banker in New York and honorary Italian vice consul in Kingston, Canada. He writes prose, has published six poetry collections and an autobiography. Welcome, Diego. So we shall start with an initial presentation of the book by the author herself. And after that, we shall have the first round of comments from the panelists. I just would like to remind you that you are all welcome to ask questions using the Q&A window that you can find at the bottom of your screen. And so let's welcome Rosanna to our virtual podium.
Thank you. I am very grateful to the organizer of this meeting that gave me a chance to talk about my book, about this incredible woman, Miriam Frankel, I met in Toronto. I belong to a place with many different names, dictated by changing historical events that always lead to confusion. This is our destiny. But it is a common fate for people on all the continent. People who live in border regions constantly face misunderstandings and numberless explanations about their place of provenance, the group they belong, the legitimacy of the language they speak, and so on. We know. This is true in Trieste, as it is in nearby Istria, Fiume, Rijeka today, Dalmatia. What hurts the people like me who live there is indifference about what has happened, the fact that someone should not bother the inquiry into the reasons why a place might have been called by different names. It's a mark of suffering for those who are born there, also because change in European history in the 20th century has not been easy, but the result of 2 wars that have devastated both the land and the human spirit. So what does this writing about that mean for me? First, the fact that Miriam, as Professor Eisenbichler told me many years ago, visits the local schools to meet the young people to talk about the Holocaust as survivor and woman who fight to continue to exist. She told to students about Trieste, Tiachiv, she was born there, and more about Auschwitz and the nihilism to fight denial. That is very, very important. This reminds me that the exile from Istria, Fiume, Dalmatia do the same after 2004, when the Italian parliament voted a law about a day of remembering, Giorno del ricordo, after 60 years of silence. Because the history about paying the war debt with properties of Giuliano Dalmatian people was shameful for the Italian politics for a long time and have to be forgotten. But now, finally, is the time for growth. When one begins to understand the complexity of historical events, one feels the need to contextualize this event. In the 1930s, before all this happened, what were the warning signs of the impending tragedy that was to strike Europe, of that future that was about to become our present? I began to research this question by conducting other interviews, looking for the stories of people who had lived in my land as foreigners. For example, the Jews of Trieste. In Canada, once again, I was able to carry out more interviews that I have elaborated into the fictionalized biography that is this book, a biography of one woman, Miriam Frankel, that is emblematic of something more. It was very important for me, for my history. The memories of the people I have interviewed have been completed by research in the State Archive of Trieste, where I spent many months looking at documents, newspapers, and records from the 1930s. They have also been enriched by field research with people who described to me with great emotion their many months in prison in Germany as Italian military internees. What is the reason these people are connected with Miriam, with her story, and you find out reading the book. This is very interesting in her narrative. The result is, in fact, a chorus story narrated through the testimony of an exceptional woman. The story has been gathered from her own lips and from those of my many other interviewees. Although it is their story, it is also my story, for it has allowed me to make a room for my own reflection as a woman who grew up in a border area where I often felt like a foreigner in my own country, but which at the same time made me a citizen of the world. And this is very nice. Miriam was born in Czechoslovakia, but was raised in Trieste, the same city that after 1947 had seen the passage of tens of thousands of refugees from the Italian land ceded to Yugoslavia, all looking for a new home. She too, like the majority of these people on the move, had chosen Canada, but only after a long road of suffering in the early 40s in Europe. The Second World War has burdened all of them with enormous sacrifice and pain, with suffering that the human mind often finds impossible to accept, even today. In the 1860s, with the peaceful and politically stable Europe in the full swing of economic recovery, immigrants from the other parts of the world began to arrive in Toronto: Chinese, Vietnamese, Portuguese, and many others. Today, there are more than 80 ethnic groups in the city. This remains the Europe of Austro-Hungarian, making it one of the most cosmopolitan urban centers in North America. They represent the real charm of this metropolis, where they all have their own small homeland. This is very, very important for me in this Europe now. Without borders for us. We live on the borders to Slovenia and Croatia, and they disappeared at the 1st of January. Here in one of Toronto's many elegant neighborhoods, I met Miriam. She comes from Czechoslovakia, where she was born, from Italy, where she grew up, from Germany, where she came to know the death of the living in concentration camps. She opened wide to me the door of her house, to her daily routines, to her story, generously lavishing me with her words and feelings. Despite being in that time more than 80 years old, her vivacity and intelligence belied her age. Incredible. Quick to analyze, she leaves nothing to chance. Her assessments are measured, her narrative is incredibly precise and clear. An open, vigilant look shines from her face. She recounted to me her long life with the energy of a young girl. When she recalls her childhood, her hazel eyes sparkle with a ray of light, with a use of violet, extraordinary like memory. And so the Italian title of the book is Maddalena gli occhi viola, eyes violet. So Miriam's eyes turn sad when she retraces her long path of non-existence in the Nazi camps. What do they hide? Nothing. And this is what's most precious. Miriam is accustomed to sharing her memories. She has been doing it for a long time, the result of a clear choice she made a long time ago. When life forces us to face inhuman difficulties, we either close or we open ourselves wide and become unaware. Often, our history and our stories are entrusted to literature or to cinema, but always true the testimony of those individuals who have tasted the bitterness of despair and now can allow themselves the only vengeance possible, the truth. This is what I want to say with my book to people who will have the patience to read it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosanna, for providing an initial idea about why and how you decided to write this book. Let's now hear Professor Eisenbichler's initial comments after his reading, kind of feedback about after his reading. Remember to...
I remembered. Thank you, Rosanna, for your presentation. Very interesting, fascinating story. I came to know Miriam when I heard her speak at the University of Toronto on Holocaust Remembrance Day many, many years ago, about 10 years ago, I would think. And she was absolutely fascinating. As you say, she was over 80 years old, but with an absolutely clear head, clear conscience, great profundity in her thought, great language. And I was thoroughly impressed by her. I am so impressed, in fact, that after the talk, there was a crowd of people that gathered around her to congratulate her, ask her questions. I stayed behind. I waited, and then I asked the organizers if they could put me in touch with Miriam to talk to her privately on some other day. And they did. I visited her at her home. And as you say, Rosanna, she opened wide the door to me as well. Very welcoming. She offered me coffee, cookies, tea. We had a wonderful chat. And I wrote a little article on her for the Bulletin Giuliano Dalmata here in Toronto, just a one-page article talking about this elderly woman who had lived in Trieste, had suffered through the Holocaust, but still remembered Trieste with fond memories and could still speak Italian. So it was really quite fascinating. She is, in fact, not only a Jewish woman, she's also a Giuliano Dalmata, like the rest of us. Subsequently, when Rosanna came to Toronto, I introduced Rosanna to Miriam. I left her there thinking she would I drove her to Miriam's house and left because I had other things to do. And I thought if I go back in an hour or so, they will have had their coffee, their tea, their cookies, and we can go home. Well, when I got back an hour later or an hour and a half later, instead of writing an article on Miriam, the two women had decided to write a book. And so that's the genesis of the Italian version of the book. And it was phenomenal. In the years that followed, Rosanna came to visit us, Giuliano Dalmati, in Toronto, but she always spent entire days with Miriam, learning about her story and also bringing back the information that Rosanna had discovered in the archives in Trieste and in Friuli Venezia Giulia about Miriam, about personal stories, personal data about Miriam that Miriam herself, of course, could not know, because when she was uprooted from Trieste, she was just a young girl, and all of her family was assassinated at Auschwitz. Her brother was assassinated in Prague and Budapest. And so she did not know some of the basic things about her family and herself. And Rosanna was able to discover those. So that is an enormous personal contribution that Rosanna's made to Miriam's life and knowledge of herself and of her family. We did a presentation of the Italian book at the Istituto Italiano di Cultura back in 2015, if I remember correctly. Very, very well attended. And there again, Miriam displayed her excellent knowledge of Italian, but she also was able to speak in Czech with one of the participants at that event. And if I remember correctly, also in German. So multilingual, besides English and Yiddish, she speaks Italian, Czech, and German. So a fascinating woman. I'll just close up my memories by saying that although I had heard Miriam speak at that event at the university, and she moved me very much by her story, and although I had come to know Miriam as a friend over the course of the years, when it came to translating Rosanna's book into English, it proved for me to be very difficult. It's one thing to hear a story. It's another thing to take that story inside of you in one language and then make it come out of you in another language. Si immedesima, that story becomes part of yourself. And as I was translating the book, there were so many times where I just had to stop and go away because it was just too emotional, too powerful to do this. So in a way, I thought I knew about the Holocaust, but in a way, I came to know more about the Holocaust in that process of internalizing and then explaining the Holocaust. I can only imagine what that process is for Miriam as she went into the schools and relived the horror that she went through. I recommend the book to everybody. It's a great read. It's a short book. It's only about 100 pages. You can read it in 1 or 2 evenings, but it will grip you. I recently sold the book to a woman that I met at the Villa Colombo, as we both go and visit our mothers at the Villa Colombo Home for the Aged. And this woman, her name is Colomba. She asked about the book and she bought a copy. And a couple of days later, she told me she started reading it and could not put it down. She was amazed by it. And then she told me that she gave it to her daughter. I said to her, no, you should have bought a second copy. But she gave her own copy to her daughter. And the daughter phoned her up and said, Mom, I cannot put the book down. So congratulations to Rosanna for having written a riveting narrative. And an enormous thank you to Miriam for having shared that narrative with us, with the schools, and now through these 2 published books, the Italian version and the English version. Sorry, I went on too long, but I'm a professor. I talk for too long all the time. Let me ask Rosanna a question. I wonder if you could, you alluded to the breakdown, the disappearance of the borders in the Schengen area. On January the 1st, Croatia just joined the area. So it's now possible to travel throughout Istria and Dalmatia, Fiume, Dalmatia, without having to stop to show your passport or to go through a border check. It's just one big region. And as you say, it's very much like Toronto. You drive through Toronto, you go through an Italian section, a Greek section, an East Indian section, an Anglo section. They're ethnic too, the Anglos. So what is it like to see this reconstituted geography for you as a Giuliano Dalmata, but also for the Jewish populations that were in Istria, were in Fiume, were in Trieste, and were separated by the borders? I think you mentioned to me some time ago about Jewish survivors of the Holocaust who coming back were not able to go back to their hometown because of the borders. Could you say something about that? The new Schengen world?
Okay, I will say that now, or we have to hear Diego Bastianiotti too. Can I answer?
I think you could answer this question, then we'll listen to Diego.
Thank you. I will try in English. If it's not, if don't work, I will pass in Italian. Okay, it's the great moment for all of us. The 1st of January was so happy. emotion was incredible, feelings incredible, because I was born with borders. I always know that the borders are there, and now they disappeared. It's an incredible moment for all of us. Claudio Magris, great writer, Italian writer, that he said that born in Istria is a tragedy and a hope. We have lived in tragedy for so many times, all my life of my father and my mother, my family. My grandma was born in Rovigno in 1905. She was Austro-Hungarian, Italian, Yugoslavia, and then Croatian. Four states, and she never moved over there. E quindi it's a very, very, very difficult life for us. And now we are finally we are in hope, not the tragedy. We pass on hope, and this is very, very important for us. I have interviewed two testimony, very important testimony of our history. One is Alessandro Cro. I have write about him, and the other is a writer, Paolo Santarcangeli. After the Second War, they come to Trieste. They were from Fiume, and Fiume was Yugoslavia, and so they can't return at home. And so they was in camps because they was Jewish, and the other time they have not be able to return at home because they were Giuliano Dalmati. And so twice they was exiled, and they went one in Italia at Torino, and the other one in Switzerland, in the other parts of Europe. And this is it's a very, very sad story. And now for us is incredible. We have organized a round table with many people, intellectual, to talk about this moment, and we are all convinced that this is the first time we are really we have really a chance to grow up all together, especially the minority groups.
Thank you, Rosanna, for your answer. And let's hear, Diego and his reaction to the text and also his experience.
Morning. Good morning, Rosanna. And thank you, grazie per il tuo libro, for your book, which I read both in Italian and in English. You have a way of seamlessly moving from what would appear to be initially an interview into a sort of identification with Miriam, where you don't know who is speaking anymore, but you know that what is being said is Miriam's thoughts. And it's beautiful, beautifully done. I am a retired professor, unlike Conrad. And so my intervention will be briefer because I'm not used to speaking publicly anymore or to a class. And I have a difficult time at my age of putting some of my thoughts together. But I would like to say a few things. One is that talking about Schengen and the fact that now there are no borders between Croatia and Italy and the rest of Europe, it reminds me of many years ago when I was just arrived in Canada, and I had a Canadian passport. And I traveled, as a matter of fact, I should say that I was also in the United States before, and I had an American citizenship and therefore an American passport. And on the question of where I was born, I would always say Fiume, Italy. Now, the Americans never questioned that. But when I traveled, the few times that I traveled to Fiume, I was promptly, as soon as I crossed the border, I was promptly stopped by the guards with the red star in the beret and told in no uncertain term, "This is Yugoslavia." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, it's your problem. When I was born, it was Fiume, Italy." And they had me stay in a little booth in a little room by myself for about a half hour, punishment for having dared to say that Fiume was under Italy at the time I was born. And I gladly went through that process, just so long as I could say no. And my passport, it's Fiume, Italy. So I broke down the borders before now. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I think I am the oldest one here in the panel. I'm going to be 84 in a couple of months. And I was born, as I said, in Fiume, Italy, when it was under one regime, a fascist regime, a dictatorship. And then we moved into another regime, the communist regime, another dictatorship. So I found it extremely important to read this book and to read a particular passage, which in the English version, it's on page 46 to 50, and in the Italian is on page 57 and on. And that is about a particular censor in the post office in Trieste. He is the petty bureaucrat, if you like, a pencil pusher or a paper pusher, as you say, who happens to run across the letter that Miriam's parents wrote to her brother, hoping that he would help them flee from Italy, save themselves. Well, the pencil pusher apparently is a typical insignificant piece of the machinery of the fascist state. That's what keeps the fascist state in power. People that are afraid of their own shadows, that feel constantly spied upon, and afraid who is listening to what, afraid even that someone may be listening to their own thoughts. And I found that description, Rosanna, extremely interesting in order for us to explain to people that have not lived under fascism or any kind of dictatorship what it is like and why we should be very careful, even today. Now, what are the warning signs of a rising dictatorship? How do we know how to identify them? And what happens in that short scene that you have over, I think, 4 pages, reminded me of a short story by Franz Kafka. It's in Metamorphosis. And it is the story of a dog who is being whipped by his master. And at a certain point, the dog grabs the whip from the master's hand and begins to whip himself or itself, wanting to be his own master of his own destiny. And he doesn't realize that this is all an hallucination, a fantasy created by a knot that the master has put on the whip that forces him to think that he is his own master. And this I found very illuminating in understanding what happens in a dictatorship, how it grows and spreads its tentacles. It infiltrates everyone's mind through fear, suspicion. I found that extremely interesting, and I would like, if possible, if Rosanna could expound a little bit more on the idea of dictatorships and how they control. Rosanna?
Ok, sì, ci sono.
Non so se Mi hai
Ho
capito? Sì.
capito perfettamente. È un personaggio immaginario.
Sorry if I just interrupt you, just in case you would like to speak Italian, I'm sure Professor Eisenbichler will be able to interpret your Italian for the audience. And also remember that you are always free to ask questions through our Q&A panel, a little window. Thank you.
Ok, ok. È un po' difficile da spiegare questo concetto, per questo parlerò in italiano così riesco a trovare meglio le parole. Se Cora traduce alla fine?
No, I don't know if I should do instantaneous translation or not. I just wonder if how many people do not understand Italian. Do we need to have it in English?
Ok, but
Yes, somebody has put up their hand.
yeah. Okay,
Okay, so we'll
okay,
do it in
okay.
English. So
Allora, è un
Rosanna
personaggio.
is saying that it's a
Okay.
difficult concept to talk about dictatorship. That's why she wants to do it in Italian, so she can be more subtle with her language. And I hope I will be with the translation.
Ok, grazie. È un personaggio immaginario, questa è la prima cosa che voglio sottolineare.
It's an imaginary person. And that's the first thing she wants to underline.
Ecco, siccome non riuscivo a spiegarmi perché questa lettera fosse della mamma di Miriam, fosse stata ferma a Trieste per 2 anni, ho dovuto immaginare che cosa fosse successo. E in questo cercare di capire il meccanismo, e chiedendo naturalmente come funzionavano le poste, ho individuato questo personaggio che per paura recò danno a questa famiglia, perché a causa sua morirono tutti, fuorché Miriam.
The letter is an actual real letter that Miriam's mother wrote to her half-brother in Chicago in the United States, asking his help to flee Europe and go to the United States. The letter did not reach the brother in Chicago, but laid in Italy for 2 years and then was sent back to Miriam's mother. And so Miriam does not know why the delay, why the letter did not go to Chicago. And so Rosanna had to try to figure something out. And that's the fictional part of the narrative, this little episode that tries to explain why a letter remained in Italy. And so she created the figure of the petty bureaucrat at the post office, which Professor Bastianuti has so nicely elucidated.
Ecco. Credo di aver risposto, volevi ancora... Io posso continuare, però il professore poi deve tradurre. Ecco, il personaggio per me era centrale nel capire cosa significava vivere nella società di quel momento, perché la famiglia alla fine, all'inizio il papà di Miriam non voleva crederci, e anche questo è una cosa incredibile, perché è un po' come fanno gli esperimenti. Un scienziato potrebbe spiegare che è come far morire una rana dentro l'acqua che bolle lentamente, non si accorge di andare verso la morte. Così le persone che vivevano in Italia, che erano della comunità ebraica, erano convinti che la cosa si sarebbe risolta in breve tempo, che sarebbero riusciti ad arrivare ad un compromesso, che le leggi razziali non sarebbero state applicate così come erano state annunciate quel terribile 18 settembre proprio qui a Trieste del 1938, e quindi loro attendevano che qualcosa succedesse. E quindi scrissero a questo personaggio e questi loro parenti in America, aspettarono una risposta, il tempo passò e quindi non riuscirono in effetti a salvarsi. E questa è una cosa terribile, perché noi quando siamo fuori dalla storia riusciamo a dare un giudizio, ma quando siamo all'interno della storia lasciamo che la storia ci condizioni, che molte volte la storia decida per noi. E questa consapevolezza che riguarda la vita di Miriam, della sua famiglia, ma riguarda anche tanta parte di vite che io ho avuto modo di far testimoniare nelle mie interviste, mi ha colpito moltissimo. Da qua questo desiderio di creare questa figura che spiegasse questa inevitabilità della sorte, tante volte messa nelle mani di un semplice funzionario che ha tanta paura di vivere da dare la morte agli altri.
If you hope that I will translate all of that, you've got something coming. Briefly, what Rosanna has said, which is fascinating, is that you've got two sides of a coin. On the one side, the petty bureaucrat, the person that goes through life in a dictatorship, doing his job, her job, and is not conscious of being a cog in the great machine of dictatorship.
Yeah.
That's one side. The other side of the coin is the victims themselves. Well, the petty bureaucrat is also a victim, but the other side of the coin, in the example of the Jewish community in Trieste, is that the hope they had that things would be okay in the end, that in fact they're going to survive, things are going to work out. And it's a vain hope, because under a dictatorship, there is really no hope. So I think that's what Rosanna was driving at in her longer presentation. In a way, for me, it's also fascinating because Rosanna was born and grew up in a dictatorship of Marshal Tito. And so she lived that experience in prima persona herself, as some of us, most of us have not. And so that's a very, very moving analysis there.
L'altra cosa che volevo dire è che proprio questo tipo di atteggiamento io l'ho voluto sottolineare nel libro perché è un grande insegnamento di un messaggio per il futuro. Se noi non ci rendiamo conto delle ingiustizie che abbiamo intorno, rischiamo di soccombere. E quindi bisogna stare molto attenti, reagire, cercare di pensare al futuro, cercare di proiettarci nel futuro per capire quelli che possono essere gli scenari politici, economici, perché con le cose che ci succedono intorno, anche noi adesso qua in Europa con una guerra praticamente all'interno, molti dicono sì, ma non è lontano dai confini europei, ma anche quella è Europa, perché si è allargata l'Unione Europea. L'Europa è un concetto un po' diverso. La Russia è Europa, non Europa. L'Ucraina è Europa, non Europa. Pensiamoci, perché è un concetto esteso. Quindi bisogna stare molto attenti a quello che succede e anche cercare di prevedere quali possono essere le mosse del futuro e cercare di combattere per cercare di cambiare gli eventi.
I am certain that these considerations that we're making now for Trieste, for contemporary Europe, for Trieste under the fascist regime, where both the Jewish population and the Aryan population, if I can use that term, were part of the problem, and we're also victims of the problem, because in the machinery of dictatorship, that's how it works. And I'm sure that that's probably the same mechanisms that were going on in Germany at that time, where the petty bureaucrat Germans and the Jewish population of Germany were conscious and at the same time were ignoring the developing maelstrom, as the English title of the book says. Were unaware that they were getting caught up in this maelstrom of history with its horrible results. In a way, if I can be contemporary for a moment, last night in the news, I was listening somewhere in the United States, 5 policemen have been charged with the murder of a man. And it was interesting to see in the news report that each of those 5 policemen did a little bit that led to the death of that man. It was not one policeman that killed him. It was not 5 policemen that killed him, but each one in particular did something that contributed to that man's death. And I think that's a real case example of the larger context of how, without realizing it perhaps, or consciously, you contribute to the dictatorship, and the dictatorship commits the crime. That's a little bit too recent for us.
Just to also thank you very much, Rosanna. I just would like to suggest to show the picture of Miriam so that we have really a visual image of about her story. So I would like to ask, to share that. There you go. Because as we all know, sometimes an image speaks 1,000 words. And now we get to know Miriam, basically, at least how she looked like. And we have been talking about this wonderful, marvelous book. If anybody's interested, the book in English, translated by, written by Rosanna, translated by Professor Eisenbichler, is available. And there you go. If anybody is interested, it can contact the Club Giuliano Dalmato here in Toronto through that website, and so that I can send a message and purchase the book. And I just wanted to just add that, because it really, as you said, is so compelling that needs to be read as much as possible by the wider audience. Again, as we said, and like Rosanna was saying, it's important to remember, but it's also important to be aware of small little actions that have happened in the past. And like Primo Levi was saying, it happened, so it can happen again. And that was his fear. And this is also, I think, what Rosanna was saying. Let's be aware of the small bureaucrat that indirectly is caught in this machine, but indirectly causes the death of a whole family. So let's be aware of these little signals and let's react. Otherwise, like, we don't want this to happen again. And I think this book goes, besides telling this amazing story, very personal, very compelling, and like you cannot put the book down, but it may this book also be a little alarm of being aware of our surroundings.
If I can, this is true. I have written a book that once Miriam taught to the students, and one girl was crying, and she asked why, and she said that her grandpa was Nazi, but he's a good person. And this is un ulteriore chiarimento di ciò che è il messaggio. Le brave persone possono far del male se sono messe in queste condizioni. If this is condition, the good person can be worst.
Yes, it's also what Hannah Arendt would call the banality of evil, unfortunately. And so books like yours, Rosanna, are here not only as a reminder, but also as a lesson, especially for the young generations, and to the traps, the little traps that are all around us. And what also Diego was, Professor Bastianotti was trying to also ask you about, which are the signs of the little signs that might lead us towards an authoritarian regime or towards a form of dictatorship, also in our democratic societies, which is exactly what happened in Germany in the 1930s, in Italy in the 1920s. I don't know whether you would have any other answers, or even also Professor Bastianotti and Professor Eisenbichler would have any comments on that. And remember that you can also ask questions by raising your hand if you don't like to write in the chat. Diego.
May I? Yes, it was precisely that, the signs. What are the signs? I was asking myself, are words signs? Carlo Levi talks about words being like stones. And stones tend to leave a deep scar, both in our bodies and in our soul. And I was wondering, how do words work? And I remember that when we were still living in Fiume under Tito, we were considered fascist by the mere fact that we were Italian. Much like if you were Jewish, then you were vermin that had to be exterminated. but we were fascist automatically. When we left Fiume and we came into Italy, there too, we were called either Croats or fascists. When we arrived in the United States, the first thing, well, we were called alien and DPs, which are other labels, DPs being Apollida. But when we arrived at our final destination in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to greet us at the train station was the Italian priest that had sponsored us. He had an assistant with him, and he referred to us, talking to the assistant, take care of these 4 pieces, as if we were luggage. This was another label that we had pinned on us. Then I was called a Dago, just a WAP, Dago. I had to change my name from Diego to Luis in order to avoid having to argue all the time. I'm just wondering, each time we receive a label, we are dehumanized. We become a thing. Not as bad as the Jewish people that had a number tattooed on their arm, which turned them into an object, much like a book that has the code bars or barcodes that say this is an object, you can buy it. If you pass it through the cashier, she'll know exactly how much it's worth. We had become objects. And I wonder what comes after that. When you become an object and you become depersonalized, de-individualized, does that rationalize more any act of violence, both verbal and physical, against you? Does it make it easier? Because you are just an object after all. You're part of a group that is called Jewish or Italians or whatever you. Does it make it easier? And I like all of you, if you could, to comment on this. Am I wrong, or are we facing a situation that maybe we are not seeing yet for what it really is and what it means and what it might lead to? I leave the comments to you.
Professor Eisenbichler, would you like to comment on that?
Well, as Diego was speaking, all I could think of is Putin calling the Ukrainians fascists. That word is still there, and it's still being used to characterize people so that you can then kill them, so you can get rid of them. Also, when Diego was talking about being called a WAP, I remember when I came to Canada as a 13-year-old, the only language I spoke was Italian, but my family technically was not Italian. We came with Austrian passports because my dad was Austrian and my mom was Italian. But at school, I could not speak a word of English. I just spoke Italian. And on many, many occasions, I was called a WAP, which took me a while to figure out what the word meant. And when I discovered what it meant, I was doubly insulted, I suppose, or doubly upset. First, because it's a derogatory term. And secondly, and because I was not really an Italian, I was an Austrian. Now I consider myself Italian because I realize that nationality is irrelevant. What is relevant is your culture. And I grew up in an Italian culture, although I was holding an Austrian passport. And although my name is Austrian, but my culture, my language, the way I think and the way I dream is Italian. So I am Italian. So the question of identity, which Rosanna has mentioned in her preliminary comments, is very important. What is it to be Italian? What is it to be Jewish? what is it when you're both Italian and Jewish at the same time? Fascinating conversation. I don't know if Rosanna has a comment on that.
La condizione di noi gente di confine.
The condition of us who live at the border. Yeah.
Essere l'uno e l'altro. Essere continuamente dall'una e dall'altra parte. Cercare di portare la propria cultura ai vertici, però conscienti di rappresentare anche un altro tipo di cultura che avviene nell'osmosi, nel cambio, nel contatto con queste persone. E questa è una cosa che si impara sin da piccoli, che è difficile da portare avanti, è una specie di valigia che ci portiamo sempre appresso, però è anche importante perché questa valigia è piena di ricchezza, per cui ci rende nello stesso tempo, ci rende difficile, ma anche di grande qualità il nostro modo di vivere.
Speaking about being bearers, carriers of culture, I wonder if Rosanna could say a few words just to change the topic. It's become a bit heavy. Change the topic a little bit to tell us about the contribution of the Jewish community in Trieste to the culture of Trieste.
Wow.
From what I know is that they contributed immensely to Trieste. I wonder if you could just in a few words summarize.
You and Diego told about your experience, like people who moved from Europe to America. But when I asked to Miriam, what does it mean to be survivor after Holocaust? She told me, she answered to me with interesting words. I want to read because it's very, very interesting. As it is the mood of this book. And the mood of the Miriam too. My fate helped me. My brother who welcomed me into the Jewish community, into their houses, helped me. They made me grow, mature. They allowed my liveliness to find its path again and reveal itself. After a few years, when I stepped the courtship game, I realized that in my heart, there was room for the other feelings. I let pain flow away and I fell in love. This is very important. I was full of pep. Young men noticed me. I embraced life challenge. I got married. My children were born. Then my grandchildren. We're a big family. The photos on the piano tell my Canadian story. Family marriage, birth, everyday life, and in the middle, that photo from Trieste that brought me back to Italy. And they returned to Trieste a few times, but the pain was too hard to
bear. Too hard to bear.
Yeah. And so when she felt about Trieste, she's happy. Yeah, Trieste is the only one city town when she has the entire family with her. And so it's Trieste is very important for Miriam. The Jewish community in Trieste has not many people, but they are important because they are la rappresentazione di una cultura che fa parte della città da sempre. Gli ebrei a Trieste sono sin dal 1300. Puoi tradurre?
The Jewish community in Trieste is small now, but they've been there since the 1300s.
Yeah. E così è molto importante per la città perché fa parte della cultura della città ed è questo che molte volte bisogna sottolineare. Quando noi abbiamo una realtà multiculturale e si perde una parte, ne perdono tutti, diventano tutti più poveri. Puoi tradurre?
When Rosanna's pointing out that when you live in a multicultural world, if you lose one of those cultures, everybody loses something. That brings to mind the Canadian idea of the Canadian mosaic. If you have a mosaic and you take one tessera out, you ruin the mosaic. And that's what it is with multicultural societies like Trieste, like Canada, like the United States, like Europe.
Ecco perché qualche giorno fa una persona mi ha detto che noi distinguiamo tra cittadinanza e nazionalità. Siamo cittadini italiani o croati di nazionalità o slovena o italiana o croata. E questa persona ha detto, beh, siccome adesso siamo tutti Europa, possiamo scrivere europei e finisce là. Non è vero. Non possiamo scrivere europei. Noi dobbiamo dire che siamo italiani, croati, sloveni o italiani, che siamo in Croazia italiani o sloveni o qualsiasi altra nazionalità, ungheresi e tutte le nazionalità che ci sono, perché questa è la vera forza. Il rispetto delle nazionalità, dei gruppi minoritari e il rispetto del mondo. Senza gli ebrei questo mondo è più povero, è meno importante. Pensate soltanto a quante menti eccelse ha dato il popolo ebreo, per cui queste cose sono da considerare. Puoi tradurre?
You asked me to translate such huge passages. Rosanna is making the point of the difference between citizenship and nationality. You can be a citizen of a country, but your nationality can be something different. So you could be a citizen of Italy, of Slovenian nationality, or a citizen of Canada with Italian nationality. And that's an important distinction. Somebody might say, well, if we, now that Europe is united, we could just say that we are Europeans, all Europeans. She says that's not the point. The point is that there is richness in diversity. And so every nationality should continue, every minority should continue to contribute to the whole, to the larger whole.
Ecco perché scrivendo la storia di Miriam ho sentito un'incredibile empatia con questa persona, perché ho capito che anche lei appartiene a una realtà che è in qualche modo minacciata. E quindi di fronte a come sono minacciate tantissime persone, tantissime comunità in tutto il mondo, per cui è per questo che Miriam diventa emblematica. E quando ho scritto il libro ero veramente presa da questo libro, mi sono sentita coinvolta completamente in questa storia, perché la sua è una storia emblematica di noi tutti. Se noi perdiamo la possibilità di essere ciò che siamo, perdiamo noi stessi, noi perdiamo il mondo perde una ricchezza.
Miriam is emblematic. Rosanna saying Miriam is emblematic of all of us, because if we lose who we intrinsically are, we lose and the world loses. I wonder, Rosanna, if you could read the passage from the book where Miriam sees her father in the concentration camp, and he tells her what to do. Because that's a question, that's the moment where Miriam assumes her Jewishness fully, consciously.
The father asked if she pray.
Yeah.
And she answered, why I can pray? I have to pray. Nothing exist if this happen. And his father said, no, you have to pray. You need to pray because if you pray, you know everyone, you know who you are, and it's important to survive.
And that's the moment that Miriam starts to pray, starts to think of herself as fundamentally a Jew, and gains her identity. Not her hope yet, just her identity. The hope will come later when she meets the 2 Italian soldiers in the concentration camp. So that's a very fascinating moment. And in fact, you know, there are many types of Jewish, you can be Jewish in many ways. And Miriam is an Orthodox Jew. So very much a fundamental, firm believer in the religion. Not a liberal Jew, not a Reformed Jew, but an Orthodox Jew. And that for her is very important.
I have found with her the kosher cuisine. and was for me amazing. For me, it was an incredible experience, and I am grateful to Miriam to introduce me and in this different of living. It's a very, very interesting. And
I can just,
yeah.
please go ahead. Sorry.
And I realize that many recipes of my land are near connecting with kosher cuisine. It is very interesting.
Just to connect to what you have just been saying, Rosanna, if we can just make this big distinction between culture, identity, nationality, and citizenship. We are forced perhaps sometimes within a certain citizenship, a certain nationality, but every one of us can embrace a culture just by studying this culture, just by opening up to another culture. And this is the beauty that makes things a little bit less rigid as with the concept of nationality and citizenship, the fact that cultures are much more fluid and open and without really borders. And so everyone can cross those kind of borders and, for example, learn how to cook kosher, how to eat kosher.
The culture is identity, and identity is culture. It is the same thought, and it is very important to know what we are, because this appartenance is very important for the person, for the human spirit. I remember when Diego came to Fiume in 230. Yes, and we have a great meeting of the Fiumani in the world, and he came in Fiume, and we organize a great presentation of his poems, and was incredible moment. And he write that in this moment he found out his family, his people, and he let the favor of soil to go, because he found himself. It was very, very important. A moment of identity, a real moment of identity. Do you want to say something, Diego?
Yes, I felt it was all thanks to you, as usual, that got me there. And surrounded me, I should say, rather than surrounded me, embraced me, not just you, but all the Fiumani embraced me within that palace, that Palazzo Modello. I felt embraced by my own people, by my own culture, by my own language. I felt I could be myself. And in so doing, I discovered who I really was and could be, without shame, let's say, or without having to explain or justify to anyone. Until then, I had lived in a world and within a family that could not understand me and what I missed, what I lost, and what I was suffering.
The embrace that you're talking about reminds me of the embrace that Miriam felt when she came to Toronto and was embraced by the Jewish community in Toronto. And here is this Jewish refugee orphan who's lost every member of her family in Europe, being welcomed by this new family. And that's exactly what Diego's talking about in another context.
Yes, you're quite right. It was a beautiful moment. And as a matter of fact, I think Rosanna remembers that when she physically embraced me, I broke down and cried. So that was me. Rosanna, could I ask you a question? In writing this book, which were the parts that you found most difficult to write, and which ones were the ones that you let it flow, that you felt so so completely fused with Miriam's story?
È stato molto difficile l'inquadramento storico, perché ho dovuto fare tantissime ricerche. Quando mi sono lasciata andare,
Good small portion. The historical context was the most difficult because it required a lot of research.
e la storia è sempre difficile da raccontare, perché come voi sapete la storia ha tante sfaccettature e ognuno la racconta a suo modo. E quindi essere obiettivi, si fa fatica ad essere obiettivi. Ci vuole molto impegno. Vuoi tradurre?
It's difficult to be objective because once you start to narrate a story, it becomes your own. And so it becomes subjective. So that was the hard part.
Invece quando ho potuto usare la mia fantasia per immaginare ciò che succedeva a Miriam sia al campo di concentramento, ci sono particolari che lei mi ha soltanto accennato, che poi ho dovuto ricostruire anche cercando di parlare con persone che erano passate attraverso la stessa tragedia, le stesse difficoltà, gli stessi momenti terribili. E quindi ho intervistato tanti sopravvissuti per poter scrivere la storia di Miriam, e questa è stata la cosa più bella, perché io amo parlare con la gente, amo raccogliere le loro testimonianze, e quindi è stato anche per me un arricchimento scrivere di questi momenti, anche se erano momenti molto pesanti, ma mi sono lasciata andare come se in qualche modo io la seguissi in questi momenti.
What was easier and was when Rosanna used her imagination to expand on details that Miriam had told her, and to tell a story that is more of a literary narrative. And that's the easier part, because then she just flowed along with that. I'm not a very good instantaneous translator. Sorry.
Va bene così.
You're a beautiful translator, Conrad, absolutely.
Yeah, I summarize and make it up.
Someone in the Q&A asked again where they can find the book, and we have provided again the website where you can find and order the book through the Giuliano Dalmato Club. So it's www.giulianodalmato.com. Here it's again. And remember that you can always raise your hand or write in the Q&A if you have any questions for the panelists. It would be also interesting, Rosanna, if you could tell us a little bit more about the Italian soldiers who were at the camp, and who, one of them in particular, helped Miriam and gave her hope, and as Conrad was already mentioning.
Certo, grazie. Non dimentichiamoci di dire che la copertina del libro è opera di un'autrice dell'Istria, si chiama Nevia Gregorovic, e mi ha regalato questo quadro per la copertina del libro perché sembrava veramente un vortice del mare che ricorda un po' la storia, e da qui anche il titolo del libro, cioè Ispirati. Ecco, per cui la ringrazio. Conrad, se vuoi dire.
Rosanna wants to thank the painter, the artist who did the painting that's illustrated in the cover,
Nevia
Gregorovic, who is from Istria, and donated a painting to Rosanna and allowed Rosanna to use it as the cover. It represents the vortex of the Maelstrom.
Ok, la storia dei militari internati italiani è una storia nella storia e meriterebbe un secondo libro, in effetti.
The Italian military internees are a separate story that has not been told very well yet, and really requires its own book.
Ero con Conrad Eisenbichler del premio Flaiano, perché sempre succedono queste cose quando c'è Conrad in mezzo. Ero al premio Flaiano e abbiamo conosciuto un bellissimo personaggio, che poi è diventato anche nostro amico, che parlando con lui delle cose che stavo facendo, gli ho detto che stavo scrivendo questo libro, gli ho raccontato la trama e lui mi ha detto: ma sai che mio padre era uno degli internati militari italiani? Perché gli avevo detto che uno di questi internati aveva salvato Miriam praticamente e l'ha salvata usando la lingua italiana.
When Rosanna and I were in Pescara for the Flaiano Prize, we met, come si chiama? Mi è sfuggito il nome,
Lo ricorderemo.
ricorderemo. We met this distinguished gentleman, professor at the University of Pisa, and his name just evades me right now, who asked Rosanna what she was doing. She told him she's writing this book, and he mentioned to her that his father had been an Italian military internee in the concentration camps in Germany.
Yeah. E allora lui mi ha praticamente aperto un'altra via perché mi ha raccontato che mi ha detto che c'era un libro che raccontava la storia degli internati italiani e che era stato scritto dal comandante del campo che proveniva da Spalato e si chiamava Testa di cognome e che aveva scritto un libro per raccontare questa esperienza. Io naturalmente mi sono messa alla ricerca del libro, l'ho trovato difficilmente perché era difficile trovarlo, ma sono riuscita ad arrivare alla biblioteca dell'esercito, mi hanno mandato questo libro e finalmente ho conosciuto anche questa storia che è diventata parte del libro. Meriterebbe una storia a parte perché questi militari italiani che non hanno voluto aderire alla Repubblica Sociale, che non hanno voluto combattere con i partigiani ed erano stati soprattutto presi nell'ex Jugoslavia e in questi territori, sono stati deportati in questi campi e là hanno fatto una prigionia terribile. Non erano schiavi come gli ebrei, ma comunque facevano una vita molto dura perché era una vita da internati. E uno di questi ragazzi salverà Miriam perché mentre negli ultimi giorni della sua permanenza al campo di concentramento, veramente l'avevano trasferita in una fabbrica, lei credeva di non aveva più il senso dell'esistenza, non esisteva più, non c'era più, era già morta in effetti. A un certo punto ha sentito dire: ma chi sono queste ragazzine? E sentendo la lingua italiana, che era stata la sua lingua per tanto tempo, per lei è stato il momento più difficile della prigionia e da quel momento ne è uscita. È riuscita a risalire con grande difficoltà, con grande sofferenza, ma proprio grazie alla lingua italiana lei è riuscita a recuperare se stessa, ad avere ancora una volta speranza. E questo giovane l'ha salvata.
Allora, la persona che è stata la chiave per questo è Salvatore Settis.
Esatto,
Grandissimo
e lo
studioso.
ringraziamo.
Abbiamo avuto questo vuoto mentale.
Tutti e due.
But oh, sorry, I was speaking in Italian. I didn't realize it. I'm sorry. The person whose name we could not remember is Salvatore Settis, who's one of the great minds of Italy. And in fact, at one point, he was even considered to be for the position of president of Italy, but then it was awarded to somebody else. Salvatore Settis told Rosanna that the story of these Italian military internees was actually narrated by the commander of one of these groups, a fellow by the name of Testa, who came from Spalato, today Split, and was one of these internees. And he wrote a book about it. So Rosanna was able to get her hands on that book, find out more, and then interview more people. The problem with these internees is that they were Italian soldiers. And after Italian capitulated to the Allies in September of 1943, those Italian soldiers who found themselves in Eastern Dalmatia had the choice of either joining the partisans, some of them did, or joining the Germans, some of them did, or not joining anybody. And those who did not join anybody were taken prisoners by the Germans. But because of agreements between Italy and Germany, they could not be considered war prisoners. And so they were just held and put to work. And it was two of these internees who, walking by and looking at the Jewish prisoners working in the armament factory in Buchenwald, was it, if I remember?
No, Lesleben.
Lesleben, saw these young women and said in Italian one to the other, "Who are these young women?" And when Miriam heard this Italian being spoken, suddenly memories of Trieste came back, and she had been spiritually dead at that time. She started to come back to life. And Rosanna didn't say it, but she started to communicate with these soldiers. See, since the Jewish Holocaust prisoners were not allowed to speak, but were allowed to sing, she started singing in Italian, making up words on tunes of songs to let these two Italian soldiers know that, yeah, she is here, she is a girl, and she's a Jewish prisoner. And so they gave Miriam hope. And when the camp was liberated, they helped her get back into life. And from there, she went to Prague, and from Prague to Canada.
Thank you, Conrad. And I think with this last note on the Italian language being able to, spiritually help even in the most tragic situations, I think we can wrap up and get to the end of this roundtable and to commemorate the day of remembrance for the Shoah. We thank you, Veronica Manson from the Istituto Italiano di Cultura, Istituto, the Cultural Institute of Italy, and for Professor Diego Bastianutti, Professor Konrad Eisenbichler, and in particular, our author, Rosanna Turcinovich Giuricin, for being with us today, and for all of you attending this roundtable and this with day of commemoration.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rosanna. Thank you very much. Thank you to our
Bye.
speaker. Thank you, Arianna. It is true. It's good to finish, as we were saying, Primore, we were saying, the words can be like stones, or the words can save you. So this is really something to consider. Thank you very much, and shalom.
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 Shalom.